Mvvm. Let's start talking about the Mvvm design pattern. Now, before we start talking and diving into this subject, I would like to invite you to join us, to join the over 1,000 students already enrolled into the Windows Universal App Development course that I have built and published on Udemy. We are covering a lot of subjects into this course, one of them being this particular subject, Mvvm, but we're also covering API requests. We're actually using the Foursquare API for these examples. We will be covering Azure integration with your Windows application. We're covering SQLite. We're covering a lot of things. So if you're interested in Windows Universal App Development, go ahead and copy that link right there in the screen or on the description below and check it out. And if you like it, which I'm sure you will, you can actually get it for only $29. That's $100 off from the original price. So go ahead, what are you doing? You can come back to the video after you have purchased this course. Now, let's dive into what Mvvm is first. Well, Mvvm is a design pattern, and we usually use the design pattern when we want to have our code in a certain order so we can reuse it in a better way, so we can maintain it better, and in the context of reusable code is even more useful if you are developing an application that is going to run on different platforms. So if let's say that you have a Windows Presentation Foundation application, a Windows application, a Windows Phone application, and even with Xamarin, you could have an iOS and an Android application and only code the model and the view model once. With Mvvm, you can actually share the entire model and the entire view model throughout all of these platforms that I've already mentioned. The only part of the Mvvm that would require platform-specific code would be the view, because you wouldn't like the exact same UI to be from the Windows Phone on a desktop environment. You don't want the same UI on a phone or on a tablet or in a desktop. It's just nonsense. It's nothing. It's something that you don't do. So you would only require platform-specific code for the view. So let's start talking about each of these modules that conform the Mvvm design pattern. And the first one is the view, and you maybe have already imagined what the view is. And yes, it's the user interface. It's whatever the user is going to be looking at on the screen. So every single element that you define that is going to be showing on the screen is part of the UI, but only the UI, only the elements on the screen, no code, no logic, only the user interface. Now the view model, this is where all the fun would happen. This is where all the logic of your application would be. So, transforming the data, playing with the data, everything that you have to do for your application to do what it's supposed to do, it's going to be in the view model. Now the model is going to be the abstraction of the problem, and when you abstract the problem, you create classes. So you can think about the model as all the data that is going to be required for your application to work. So it's quite simple. The view is the UI, the elements on the screen. The view model is the logic, what's going to happen for your application to give the expected result. And the model is the data, how the data is going to be shown, how the data is abstracted from the problem. So the way that the view is going to communicate with the view model is called data binding, and we'll talk about data binding in just a second. But what you want to do right now, what you want to know right now is that the view and the view model can communicate directly through something called data binding. And this is quite specific to the SAML language. So you would have to know a little bit about SAML to start understanding what data binding is, and we'll cover it throughout these videos. The communication between the view model and the model is going to happen through something called notifications. And these notifications run from the model all the way to the view and even the other way around, so that the model and the view know when something has changed, some values on certain object have changed, so both the model and the view have the exact same value, either showing or on the logic. So let's dive a little bit more on data binding. Let's talk about what data binding is. So data binding is going to happen between the user interface and the logic of your application. Now, in your user interface, you would have a dependency object, which would have a dependency property. And in your logic, in the logic of your application, you would have an object and a property, an instance of a class that has certain properties, and you want to bind this together with the user interface. So, for example, you have a dog with a property name, which is a string, and you want to bind that property name to a dependency property, maybe on a text block, on the user interface. Now, this data binding can happen on three modes, on three ways. The first one being one way. One way only happens from the object to the dependency object. So the dependency object cannot change the value of the object. Only the object can change the value of the dependency object, or rather, the property of the object is reflected on the dependency property of the dependency object. But the dependency property, even if it changed its value, wouldn't change the value of the property on the object. If you would like to do it both ways, you can establish a two-way data binding. In this case, when a property on an object changes, the dependency property on a dependency object changes with it. And the same goes the other way around. If the dependency property changes, the same changes are reflected on the property of the object. And you can do a data binding that's one way to source, which means that only when the dependency property changes, the property is going to change. But if the property changes, the dependency property won't change. So, binding. We are going to establish this binding through two interfaces that we're going to be talking about. And the first one is going to be the I command. The I command is going to kind of be the replacement for an event handler. So instead of having an event handler for the click event on a button, you will have a command bound to a button, which is going to execute certain code that is in a class which implements the I command interface, and this class would be in your view model. The other interface that we are going to be talking about is the I-value converter interface. The I-value converter interface is going to be very helpful if you want to convert a certain value to a different type. So the most common example that I found is changing female or male to an image. So for example, a person on the view model or on the model would have a property which is sex or gender, and it could be either female or male. But in the view, I don't just want to print a string. I want an image, maybe a beautiful pink image of a woman when the person is a female, and a blue person when the person is a male. So this conversion can actually be implemented quite easily with the I-value converter. So the I-value converter would actually be implemented into a class, and that class would have to be inside of the view model as well. Now, the interfaces that we will be using for notifications, in fact, the second one is not an interface, only the first one, but The one that we are going to be using is iNotify property changed. The iNotify property change is going to raise an event whenever one of the properties changes. Now we will have to call this event every time the value of these properties change, and we're going to be talking about deeply in one of the coming lectures. But you just have to know that the iNotify property change is going to allow the model to notify the view model and to finally notify the view that certain information has changed, and so it has to be changed on the view as well. The observable collection of certain type is going to be used, it's quite similar to the iNotify property change. In fact, it implements that property, but it allows us to actually implement something like the iNotify property change on collections. You may have guessed it for the name, but this would actually raise an event whenever one of the elements in a collection has changed, when a new item has been added, when a new item has been deleted. So you can actually bind an observable collection or a class that implements implements the observable collection of type and bind it to a list in your view. So without further ado, I have to encourage you again to go and check my Windows Universal App Development course. Now we will be covering everything about MVVM here on YouTube in the coming videos. But if you want to learn just a lot more about other stuff regarding Windows Universal App Development, go ahead and check this course. Like I said, during the course, we talk about a lot of things, not only MVVM. In the course, you could actually find the foundations of using SAML with C#. You can also learn a little bit more about object-oriented programming. We will actually be integrating Visual Studio Online as a version control of your Windows applications. We will be covering adding more pages to an application. We are going to be covering text-to-speech and speech-to-text, so you can talk directly to your application, or so your application can talk to you back. We're going to take pictures with your application. We're going to use persistence with application settings and SQLite databases, notifications through the live tiles, HTTP integration, this MVVM course, Azure, sharing code between platforms, a lot of things. So why don't you go ahead and give it a look, and if you like it, you like how it looks, go ahead and purchase it for only $29, just for you who's watching this video. $29 instead of $129, which is the original price. Now you have the link right there, or you will have the link in the description below. Just make sure to check it out and start getting ready for Windows 10.